is over. The planet will never be the same. The southern United States now belongs to Mexico. Europe is the newest administrative province of Russia. Japan, Taiwan, and Australia are all governed by Beijing. Regardless of how World War III starts, it will rewrite the borders of the map, and not always in the ways you might think. We're going to examine a few hypothetical scenarios for World War III and how each would result in the shifting borders across the world. There are some key factors that must be clarified before we get started. One, we can't possibly cover every scenario in this video, but we'll examine some very intriguing outcomes based on statistical data of the most likely scenarios. Two, we'll assume nuclear weapons are used in moderation, and the war doesn't escalate into a full-blown apocalyptic event. And three, we're basing our extrapolations for the future on the information we have now and how certain nations and regimes have acted in the past. The only way that a third world war could erupt in the present day is if Russia and China combined forces and went to war against NATO. The reason for this is that neither Russia nor China is strong enough to defeat the United States and its allies alone. The reality is, even if they work together, China and Russia would likely still struggle to win an all-out war with the West. That being said, there are several scenarios where a Sino-Russian alliance could come out on top due to the massive natural resources at their disposal, the enormous size of both militaries, and China's economic stranglehold on many parts of the world. We know that the United States has the most powerful military in the world by far. We also know that NATO, on average, has better weapons and tactics than both Russia and China. However, let's examine what would happen in several different scenarios and how they could possibly result in the shifting of borders in ways we might not expect. The two sides in World War III will be NATO and the Western nations on one side, including their strategic partners and alliances around the world. This would mean that Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and parts of Latin America would also likely join on this side of the battle. The opposition would be led by China and Russia, which would also include many nations with authoritarian rulers and close ties to Moscow and Beijing. That means North Korea, Belarus, Syria, Iran, and a number of former Soviet bloc states that ally themselves with Russia and China. There's also the possibility that many Latin American and African countries will also throw their lot in with China in particular, the reason for which we'll discuss later on in this video. NATO is made up of 31 countries, most of which are in Europe, except for the United States and Canada. Similar to NATO, but by no means as powerful, is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is an alliance between Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. The CSTO has a comparable stipulation as Article 5 of the NATO agreement, numbered Article 4, which basically states an attack against one member would be seen as an attack against all members of the alliance. So if any of the 6 nations in CSTO is invaded or forced into an all-out war, all other nations will declare war on the aggressor. Now let's look at some World War III scenarios and see how allegiances shift and borders would change as a result. The first few might be shocking, as there will be some backstabbing between the supposed allies. But as we continue with our analysis, a much more hopeful picture of the world will start to emerge. Unless you're rooting for the authoritarians to win, then you will be sorely disappointed. Scenario 1. Russia's worst nightmare. The war in Ukraine has been raging for more than a year. Putin feels the impending doom on the horizon. He takes drastic actions by launching a tactical nuke at a Ukrainian base. The low-yield nuke detonates, vaporizing the base, soldiers, and vehicles in the vicinity. But since the nuclear device is only 25 kilotons, the blast radius is around 0.4 miles or 0.64 kilometers. The damage is not widespread, but it's the very nature of the weapon that elicits a response from NATO. They declare war on Russia and launch aircraft, conventional missiles, and soldiers at key targets across the border. NATO refrains from using nukes, as they don't want to escalate things further, but Putin must be dealt with. In response to NATO's invasion, Article 4 of the Collective Security Treaty Organization is initiated. Russia has just over 1 million soldiers between their active members, including those in reserve. However, since the war began, Russia has suffered close to 200,000 casualties, so things are already looking bad for Putin. He calls on his closest allies and other authoritarian rulers to aid Russia in their fight against NATO, as once Russia is defeated, the West will spread its influence even further into the Middle East and Asia. But this is a hard sell. The fighting is contained in Eastern Europe and Russia. Many leaders don't want to paint a target on their backs, so they stay out of the conflict. Other than the CSTO countries, Iran decides to fight along Russia, as its government's deep distrust for the West fuels its decision to escalate the conflict. Syria also joins Russia due to the fact that President Bashar al-Assad is afraid that if Putin loses, he'll lose his main source of weapons to control his own country. But even with aid from these nations, there is one country whose absence cannot be ignored: China. When Russia launched a nuke, even though it was a tactical one, Beijing turned its back on Putin. China has made it very clear what its stance is around using nuclear weapons. Beijing firmly believes that nukes should only ever be used in the defense of one's country and never as an offensive weapon. Therefore, the nuclear bomb that Putin dropped on Ukraine sealed his fate. China refuses to come to Russia's aid. Now, instead of receiving an influx of weapons and men, China has cut off most support to Moscow. They still buy natural resources from Russia but refuse to send military aid. In this scenario, NATO forces quickly storm through western Russia and capture Moscow. After a year of fighting in Ukraine and the worsening conditions in the country due to heavy sanctions, the general Russian population doesn't put up much of a fight to keep Putin in power. For many, their leader has failed. The superior tanks, aircraft, and technology of NATO forces allow them to deal with any defense Russia mounts. Vladimir Putin is found dead in the Kremlin with a bullet in his head from what appears to be an assassination carried out by someone in his own government. NATO would also attack any country that allied itself with Russia during the conflict. After the war, they'd have their governments dismantled and reorganized. So, if World War III ended up being Russia fighting against NATO without the help of China, there's no chance they could win a conventional war. Even with allies in this area too, many other countries would remain neutral if China did not back Russia. This includes North Korea, who more than likely would aid Russia but only if China gave them permission. Given the scenario we just outlined, if Beijing refuses to support Russia, it will likely find North Korea will do the same. After the war is over, Russia would be broken up and new governments would be put into place. There's even a possibility that China would invade Russia from the east if Beijing thought there was a chance Putin would launch more nukes and put the world at risk of being obliterated in a nuclear holocaust. In this case, China might lay claim to some of the eastern and northern lands of Russia, as there are huge amounts of natural resources such as fossil fuels and ore in some of these regions. Let's imagine, after Russia is defeated and forced to surrender, that the country is deemed too large to control by one government, and that the stability of the region might be better maintained by splitting Russia up into 8 different countries based on the borders of its federal districts. Now, instead of one giant country, there are 8 smaller ones to manage. Maps of Asia would need to be rewritten with these new borders, and each territory would be given its own name. It's plausible in this scenario that the Far Eastern and Siberian districts would come under the influence of China. Beijing would set up puppet governments in those new countries that served their interest by giving them exclusive trade deals and the rights to acquire the natural resources in the region. These nations would also serve as a buffer between China and the now pro-West nations of Western Russia. The new nations to emerge from Russia's western districts would be led by democratically elected governments. These would obviously be overseen by NATO and would have close ties to Europe and the United States. The borders of Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan would also likely remain the same, but with new governments. The Kaliningrad Oblast, which is currently a part of Russia, would likely be incorporated into Lithuania's borders rather than becoming its own country. There's also the chance that in the chaos, other players in the Middle East might take advantage of the weakened state of anyone who aided Russia. Perhaps Israel in control of Kazakhstan. It would be divided up into separate. Now let's look at a second scenario, one that'll lead you to a global conflict where every country will need to choose a side. In this second scenario, you'll be shocked at how different the world map looks when it's all over. Scenario 2. China allies itself with Russia and uses its power and influence to pull others into the conflict. World War III is about to break out. The rulers of Russia and China are trying to preserve their very way of life. The West has been encroaching closer and closer, spreading its ideologies and influence.
Do you have the menu in English, please?
Oye, ¿necesitas ayuda?
Hey.
Beijing has had enough and conducts a secret meeting with the leadership of Moscow. It's decided that if their authoritarian way of doing things is to continue, they need to deal with the United States and its allies. In order to do this, China pulls some strings. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping reach out to other authoritarian rulers around the world and warn that if they don't support Russia and China in the coming conflict, the West will come for them next. This allows Russia and China to convince many of the single-party governments and authoritarian rulers across the planet to join their side in World War III, even if they have ties to the West. Many governments in East Asia, Central Africa, and the Middle East ally themselves with China and Russia to ensure they can maintain their power after the war. China also uses its economic might to bend nations to do their will who don't initially join their side or cause. Much of Latin America is deeply indebted to China. And although the United States still has a major presence in the Americas, Mexico, Venezuela, and Brazil are forced to support China or suffer economic collapse. Beijing leverages its Belt and Road Initiative to bring other Latin American countries to its side as well. When all said and done, the desire for authoritarian rulers to stay in power and governments' willingness to do whatever it takes to keep their economies from collapsing, China gathers a lot of support. Resources, weapons, and soldiers pour into the conflict from around the world. Fighting breaks out in the Americas and in Europe. NATO and its allies can't hold off the